Ooh. Corona?
The force is strong with this one.
True. Cool.
You don't know the power of the dark side.
Hatred of the bourgeoisie. Suffering. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering, said Master Yoda. It was a major feature of the Terror, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this YOLO chat. Alright, getting a bit serious though for a sec. Historians have debated the nature of terror and its role in the Russian Revolution. It's a topic that I find really interesting, kind of a bit like in a horror movie kind of way. I'm repulsed by it, but also interested and fascinated by the nature of it, particularly its complexities. So historians, though, have talked about whether the terror evolved because in response to circumstances, particularly the Civil War and threats against the Soviet regime and its leaders, or whether ideology played a role. That thing that I already mentioned lightheartedly, the hatred of the bourgeoisie, these slogans and language of class struggle was how that drove terror, or whether there was a mix of elements to that. Alrighty then, but I would say that terror, you might want to consider that in terms of its complexity, and it's something that develops over time. Let's look at that development. Early 1918, so by this stage, we'll go for March 1918. This is after the Germans have invaded and we've had the socialist fatherland is in danger decree. It came out of the breakdown of Brest-Litovsk talks. The Cheka has grown considerably in size and its powers. It's got its own headquarters in the Lubyanka building in Moscow. It's got a staff of over 1,000, as opposed to when it started with just 24. It's got its own armed division. And its leader, its head, its chairman, Felix Dzerzhinsky, is one of the most powerful and influential people within the Soviet regime. However, that's not saying that it was an all-powerful institution, even by that stage, that local, or even the degree of its central authority might be questionable, that local Chekas had a great deal of autonomy in choosing who they repressed, arrested, and in their actions. And that's where Fijers emphasises this point, the way in which terror developed because of popular pressures, that people would denounce other people, their neighbours, bosses, people that they didn't like, and that influenced Cheka and the terror too. So it wasn't simply always centrally directed. That idea of class, hatred of the bourgeoisie, though right from the beginning was an important aspect of the Soviet regime. And you could even consider it a revolutionary ideal. And that language of class conflict certainly is articulated by the Chekists. This is a good quote by Martin Latsis, who was one of Dzerzhinsky's deputies, in explaining who was the focus of terror. Latsis says, first you must ask him to what class he belongs, what his social origin is, his education and profession. These are the questions that must determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning of Red Terror. So essentially what somebody's job was, whether they were, a bourgeois exploiter, that made them the target of the Red Terror. Another Chekist said even more simply that you just look into the soup pot, and if there's meat in that person's pot, then up against the wall. Alrighty, now there's a lot of the rhetoric, language, big talk, that goes along with this, but the statements about terror and violence. But for the most part, it wasn't until mid-1918 that the terror took on its more fearsome and organised character for which it's associated with. Nevertheless, you get lots of statements, about that the Cheka certainly was instituting a terror. I mean, you get stuff like Dzerzhinsky saying, we stand for organised terror. It becomes far more organised and escalates greatly after the 30th of August 1918, and this is a real significant turning point. This is for the Bolsheviks like their September 11. On 30th of August, Fanya Kaplan, who had links to the SRs, attempted to assassinate Lenin. So popped a couple of caps at him. One particularly bad one he copped in the neck, and he almost died. There was quite a bit of panic as the Bolsheviks tried to find some doctors who they could trust and able to treat Lenin. And for some months, he's out of action. He was desperately ill. Also, too, Moisar Yuritsky, who was the head of the Petrograd Cheka, was killed on the same day, and so was the Commissar of the Press, Volodarsky. So this sense that the Soviet regime was under attack created a great deal of panic amongst the communists, and this really drives the terror, and it will drive a sense that there must be taking a war of terror that will, these attacks by terrorists essentially would be met and conquered by even greater terror. And you get the red newspaper Krasnaya Gazeta saying, without mercy, we'll kill our enemies in the scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their blood. For the blood of Lenin and Yuritsky, let there be floods of bourgeois blood. The more blood as much as possible. Okay, that's a little bit cray. But where that becomes interesting is they actually go and attempt to implement that by executing thousands upon thousands of people. Yakov Sverdlov, chairman of the Soviets, and Felix Dzerzhinsky, in Lenin's absence, because remember, Lenin's just got okay, not feeling too good, they pass on September 5th the decree on Red Terror, and that further increases the power of the Cheka to now be able to imprison enemies of the people, class enemies in concentration camps, and to execute anyone who's, quote, involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies, and rebellions. So the Cheka is essentially building on from its powers it gained from the socialist Fatherland is in Danger decree. With the On Red Terror decree, it's now been given a blank check to kill anybody who's seen as a potential actual enemy of the Soviet state. Now, significantly too, not only is these attacks on Lenin and the others seen as like a counter-revolutionary terrorist act, it's blamed on the bourgeoisie. And like as Martin Latzer said about this, we're not waging war against individual persons, we're exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Yakov Peters, another Cheka, says, the bullet was directed not only against Comrade Lenin, but also the working class as a whole. So the attacks in August 1918 provide the justification and context for the escalation of the terror. And it's pretty awful too. So this is where it gets a little bit nasty. Actually, a lot nasty. The way in which the Cheka operated was pretty horrendous. They had a whole range of various different tortures that they inflicted on people. There was the infamous glove trick where they stuck somebody's hand in a boiling pot of water, pulled it out, and whipped off the skin like a glove. They'd got a hot pipe and put it on someone's chest and put rats in there and eat into your stomach. They threw people alive into furnaces, nailed epaulets onto people's shoulders, rolled them around spiked barrels, sawed off their limbs with blunt saws. Even really yucky things like burying people alive with a dead body, or even the psychological distress of you being, in a Cheka jail cell. You think you've been told that you're going to be executed. You're taken to the Escalation pop, and then nothing happens, and you're taken back to the cell. Like this was awful, horrendous. Now these tortures had a brutalizing and mentally, psychologically damaging effect on the Chekists themselves. Many of them went insane, were not at all mentally well, and they abused substances. They quite on the nose beers a fair bit, and deliveries of alcohol to the Lubyanka building indicated that there was going to be a batch of executions. So many of them were dulling themselves through substances. Such was the horror of what they were doing. Normally that wasn't witnessed. It wasn't like people were getting shot on the streets, but they did publish lists of people who were executed. So it certainly fulfilled that aim of terrorizing the population. And another, a bit of a tangent, but that's okay, example of just how far the violence was willing to extend was the execution of Tsar Nicholas and his family in July 1918. And you could find out a bit more about that story, but that horrifies many people. But it was justified in terms of by the Bolsheviks that they were removing the Tsar as a live banner behind which white armies might rally. All right, so how do they justify the terror more broadly? So we've already talked about that way in which ideology, okay, was used. That the Soviet regime was one that targeted, repressed, okay, was organized terror against the bourgeoisie. Um, but sometimes the terror, though, this is relating to the idea of them not being very well. The Many of the Chekists took perverse pleasure in what they did. There were quite a number of people who joined the Cheka who were criminals who came straight out of the jail system, people who themselves had been psychologically damaged by torture. Under the Tsarist regime, you get this horrendous poem written by a Chekist where he's essentially celebrating his work. There is no greater joy, not better music, than the crunch of broken lives and bones. This is why, when our eyes are languid, and passion begins to seethe stormily in the breast, I want to write on your sentence one unquavering thing, up against the wall, shoot. Now, so that's expressing quite fanatical ideas, yet certainly the Chekists and leading Chekists were fanatics, but Dzerzhinsky and Latsis and others might also be considered idealists too. And Dzerzhinsky said a lot about that he expected the Chekists to be held to a higher account. They expect them to be pure as crystal and have clean hands. Good tip currently, hey. But also too that their role was an incredibly important one. So I'll read this from Dzerzhinsky. We need to send to the front the most dangerous and cruel of fronts, determined, hard, dedicated comrades willing to do anything in the defense of the revolution. Do not think that I seek forms of revolutionary justice now. We're not in need of justice. It is war now, face to the face, a fight to the finish, life or death. So Dzerzhinsky was explaining that the Cheka was as important as the Red Army, except its war, its front was an internal one against hidden enemies, and they were therefore far more difficult to find than the white armies. Dzerzhinsky himself is a very interesting person. I encourage you to read his biography in the back of Reinventing Russia. But he was incorruptible. You couldn't fault him in terms of, or you could fault him in terms of the kind of work that he did, but he never took any bribes. He was incredibly dedicated to the revolution, would work, enormous long hours a day, refused reasonable food when it was brought to him, would fall asleep, when he was exhausted in his office. So he had this kind of like a sense of being a chivalrous crusader. The Checkers, even its symbol, its badge itself, Google that it's a sword and a shield with the sword on front. So they were the sword and shield of the revolution. And Dzerzhinsky find Chekists and who were would execute those who were corrupt, but would find those who left their wives. All right, now white terror. So that's the reason why I call this topic terror, not simply red terror, because the whites also did horrendous things as well. Some yucky stuff. So they would nail communists by their, get the right hand out, left arm and left leg, okay, to fences, buried people up to their necks or bury them upside down, would carve red stars into the back of red soldiers. There was even a case where a general captured a town, a white army general, and surrounded a factory, and he ordered that anybody of calloused hands would there be executed, because he knew that the Reds executed anybody with soft hands. But of course that's going to mean virtually every worker in that workplace then was executed. Another aspect too of white terror was its anti-Semitism. So pogroms, attacks against Jewish people and communities, was a major feature of white terror. More than speculated, up to 100,000 Jews living in Ukraine were killed by white army soldiers going on a rampage. And they made no secret of this. So white propaganda portrayed Trotsky as like a Jewish red devil and certainly tried to stir up anti-Semitic feeling. Even Vasily Shulgin, a white supporter, says he's talking about the Bolsheviks, they shouted death to the bourgeois, we shouted death to the Yids. If you don't know what that means, that's an incredibly insulting term for people of Jewish background. All right, but what am I trying to say here? Fanaticism and ideology alone don't fully explain the nature of the Red Terror. That the Cheka became an incredibly useful organisation. Dzerzhinsky was in high demand as administrator. He was an exceptionally good at organising things. He had a reputation as a man who could get the job done. In 1921, he was made Commissar of Transport. And that was a really desperate situation of trying to revive the railway infrastructure to support the economy. He did such a good job at that he was promoted to the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Economy, that's Vysenka. The Cheka itself was seen as an incredibly versatile and useful and efficient organisation. And as more problems were encountered by the Soviet regime, increasingly the Cheka was relied upon to deal with these. So it evolved from no longer simply being an extraordinary and emergency measure. The Cheka did things like policing law and order, famine relief, countering desertions, overseeing labour conscription, so that's the forced labour gangs that you'll look at when we do war communism, investigating bribery, corruption, coordinating epidemic and famine relief. I suppose a little interesting fact here, the largest children's welfare charity in Soviet Russia was run by Felix Dzerzhinsky. He was also a chairperson of Friends of Soviet Cinema. He liked the movies, he liked the disco. He did not leave his heart in capitalist San Francisco. Alrighty then, so I think that's all I need to say about that. Okay, till the next one, stay fully circle. Das Vidania.